Keeping your IT team sharp isn't optional, it's essential. CBT Nuggets delivers high-quality IT training led by real-world experts who know what teams actually need on systems teams will actually use. Whether it's staying current on cloud, networking, or security, CBT Nuggets makes training simple, effective, and scalable. No fluff, no wasted time, just smarter, faster IT teams. Thousands of companies trust CBT Nuggets, and yours can too. Go to cbtnuggets.com/solutions and start training today.
Shop the Sherwin-Williams Labor Day sale and get 35% off paints and stains August 22nd through September 4th. With prices starting at $31.84, it's the perfect time to transform your space with color. Whether you're looking to revamp your interior or exterior, we have you covered with bold hues, soothing neutrals, and everything in between. Visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store or shop the sale online. Delivery available on qualifying orders. Click the banner to learn more. Retail sales only. Some exclusions apply. See store for details.
Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. It was after midnight on January 29th, 2022, when Karen Reed pulled her SUV into a quiet cul-de-sac in Canton, Massachusetts. Snow swirled under the headlights of her Lexus as she stopped in front of 34 Fairview Road, the home of Boston police officer Brian Albert. Her boyfriend, John O'Keefe, a 46-year-old Boston cop himself, sat beside her in the passenger seat. They'd been out drinking with friends, and the night could have been winding down if not for an invitation to a bit of an after-party at Albert's home. Karen barely knew the people inside this house, but she knew enough to wonder if she should feel uneasy. Among those gathered for the after-party was a man with whom she'd shared a brief flirtation, a history that, depending on who you ask, could have added tension to the night. But John seemed eager to join the group. The plan was simple. He'd head in, check the vibe, and text Karen if she should come inside. She waited in the driveway, engine running, snow falling harder. Minutes ticked by. 6, 8, 10... No sign of John. No call, no text, no wave from the door. Sitting there in the dark, her anger flared. Had he just left her sitting there like an idiot? Maybe worse, was he sneaking around? Old jealousy still simmered beneath the surface, aided, no doubt, by the alcohol coursing through Karen's system. Finally, she put the car in gear and peeled away. By the time she got back to John's house, she was furious. She angrily called his phone, leaving him a string of voicemails laced with profanity and accusations. She slept restlessly that night, not knowing she would soon be accused of something far worse. At dawn, Karen woke to find John still wasn't home. Panic set in. She called John's friends, searching for answers. None of them knew where he was. She phoned Jen McCabe, a friend who happened to also be the sister-in-law of Brian Albert, whose home she'd left John at, and Carrie Roberts, a mutual friend. Karen and Carrie started driving through Canton's snowy streets, scanning for any sign of John. Around 6 a.m., they pulled up to the Fairview Road house where Karen had been just hours earlier. Something caught Karen's eye. A shape in the snow near the flagpole on the far side of the lawn. It wasn't near the driveway where she had left him, but it was unmistakably John. O'Keefe was lying on his back, motionless, dusted with snow. Blood pooled around his nose and mouth. Karen ran to him, brushing snow from his face, begging him to wake up. She dropped to her knees, gave him mouth to mouth, lay on top of him, trying to warm his frozen body. Carrie helped with chest compressions. Jen McCabe, who had arrived in a separate vehicle, dialed 911, but it was too late. John was cold, 80 degrees by the time he reached the hospital. The medical examiner would later rule his cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. He also had unexplained cuts and bruises along his right arm. In the haze of grief and shock, Karen reportedly blurted out 9 words that would haunt her for the next 3 years. Did I hit him? Could I have hit him? That question, asked by a distraught girlfriend, set off a firestorm. Within days, Karen Reed was accused of running down her boyfriend with her SUV and leaving him to die. Prosecutors called it a fit of drunken rage, but Karen insisted she didn't do it, at least certainly not the way it was framed, as an anger-fueled intentional act. But as investigators peeled back the layers of this case, they uncovered something far more complicated than a tragic accident. Normally on Crimes of the Centuries, we dig into cases long settled by history. But this week is different. This was supposed to be a vacation week, but instead we're examining a case so tangled, so explosive, that it's impossible to ignore. This is a bonus episode we're calling Future Crimes of the Centuries. That's with a question mark. And it's a look at the death of John O'Keefe, the trials of Karen Reed, and the questions still swirling about whether this case will someday be remembered as a defining crime of our era. You know how every few months someone pops up with, aliens built the pyramids?
Or aliens love gold and abduct people because reasons?
Exactly. Well, there's a podcast that tackles all that nonsense head on and is part of our Grab Bag Collab family. It's called More Like Ancient Phalians.
This is hosted by journalist Brandon R. Reynolds and podcaster/author Toby Ball, and they dive into the History Channel show Ancient Aliens one episode at a time.
Yeah, that show's a meme maker, and it's been running for some 21 seasons and 200 episodes, insisting aliens did it. Brandon and Toby break down those big claims, from the Big Bang to Atlantis, from the Old West to Area 51, sifting the truth from the nonsense.
And they've got amazing guests, too. Comedian Dana Gould, true crime queen Maggie Freeling, comedian and voice actor Janet Varney, and soon the brilliant humorist John Hodgman.
Plus, I even pop up in an episode or two because I want to pretend that I belong with that crew.
The best part is you can now listen to it everywhere, not just through Grab Bag Collab's Patreon.
So search for More Like Ancient Phalians wherever you listen to your favorite podcast, and let Brandon and Toby abduct you into the fun while they uncover what's really going on out there.
I'm subscribing right now.
Now, this might come as a surprise to some listeners, but I don't actually follow true crime in real time. I kind of can't anymore. I covered breaking crime in Detroit for nearly a decade and later for the Cincinnati Enquirer. Much of my career has been focused on the horrible things people do to each other, and that's still what I do here on Crimes of the Centuries. But there's something different about unpacking older cases versus covering brand new ones. Fresh cases are raw. Their impact hasn't settled. For me, they're just too emotionally draining. So when I first started hearing about the Karen Reed case unfolding in Massachusetts, I didn't have the bandwidth to give it the attention it deserved. I suspect I'm not alone. For a while, stories about it spewed out like water from a fire hydrant. I caught enough to know that there was a verdict, but not enough to understand the full picture. That's what I aim to do here, help people who have heard about the case make sense of it without requiring them to dedicate untold hours. Think of this as a primer. And to properly prime, to truly understand how the death of John O'Keefe became one of the most contentious cases Massachusetts has ever seen, you first have to know who these two people were and how their lives collided. So let's begin. John O'Keefe was a Boston police officer in his mid-40s who had traded his street beat for a desk job, partly to be more present for the niece and nephew he had taken in after tragedy struck his family. His sister, Kristen, died of brain cancer in 2013. Not long after, her husband died of a heart attack. John stepped up, becoming guardian to their two kids, Kaylee and Patrick.
He's described by most people as being very loving, very generous. He took the kids to their sports activities. He was kind of type A, but overall, a generally good guy.
That's journalist Rebecca Lavoie, host of the podcast Crime Writers On, who ended up deeply invested in this case, so much so that she made multiple appearances as an expert talking about it on Court TV. You'll hear from her throughout this episode. Karen Reed, meanwhile, came from a different but equally driven world. She was a successful equity analyst with an MBA, teaching finance classes at Bentley University. Petite, outspoken, and fiercely independent, she owned her own home and drove that luxury SUV with a six-figure price tag.
By all accounts, she was successful. She's really bright. She's very tenacious. She describes herself as having, quote, a big mouth. And I don't think anybody refutes that. She's sort of, if she thinks it, she's saying it kind of person, kind of outspoken, a little bit loud.
John and Karen had dated briefly back in 2004 after meeting at a party. It didn't last long, just one of those fleeting 20-something flings. But 16 years later, in the early days of the pandemic, a Facebook message from John changed everything. It was sort of a blast from the past message. Nothing major, just checking in to see how Karen was doing. Things moved quickly from there, with the pandemic's isolation pulling them back together. Karen quickly fell into a pseudo-parenting role for Kaylee and Patrick, helping with remote schooling and trying to fill the void their parents' deaths had left. Karen later told Vanity Fair that the whole situation had felt strangely perfect. She said, quote, "It's a Karen-sized hole in this house that I have the energy and resources to fill," end quote. But stepping into a ready-made family wasn't easy. John was naturally carrying his own grief, and the stress of parenting two traumatized kids sometimes boiled over. Lavoie points out that John could be exacting, even rigid.
For instance, many people have described John as the kind of person that if you forget to take off your shoes when you walk into his house, you have a reason to be really nervous because he's a real stickler about stuff.
By all accounts, Karen and John's relationship was passionate but volatile. She could be fiery, he could be controlling, and they clashed, especially over how to raise the kids. John reportedly resented that she got to do the fun stuff, the go-karts and fancy haircuts, while he played disciplinarian.
She describes an incredibly complicated dynamic where he wasn't really ready to be a parent, and now he has these two kids living with him. It caused a bunch of issues. Karen was sort of asked to be a surrogate mother figure, and he thought she spoiled them. It was a kind of weird and not great situation.
Both also had their struggles. Karen battled Crohn's disease, enduring 10 surgeries in 18 months, and was later diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. John was grappling with his own losses and a demanding job. And this was happening in Boston, which Lavoie describes as
maybe the most alcohol-soaked city in the country.
So drinking became a shared release valve on weekends, something Karen now regrets. Of course, there were plenty of good times, too. Over New Year's 2021, they took a vacation to sun-kissed Aruba with friends and the kids. But even that trip revealed cracks. Karen claimed she caught John kissing another woman. In fact, John's niece would later testify she heard some of that fighting. Shortly after, Karen exchanged flirtatious texts with the ATF agent Brian Higgins, who was in John's circle of friends.
And at one point, they'd even kissed. At another point, they met up, and it's not clear what happened when they met up at his house. Maybe they made out, maybe it was more than that. We don't really know. That was a couple of weeks before all this happened, and then she completely ghosted him and seemingly never spoke with him or texted him after that meeting.
Despite the turbulence, Karen and John stayed together, and in the days leading up to that snowy January night, They were, by most witness accounts, affectionate and close. At the Waterfall Bar, the last stop before everything went wrong, security footage shows John kissing Karen on the forehead. Friends said they seemed happy, which makes what happened next all the more jarring. After leaving the bar, the group headed to 34 Fairview Road, the home of Brian Albert, the Boston cop hosting the after-party. They'd never been to the house, so they pulled directions up on Waze as snow thickened in the air. When they pulled up, there weren't as many cars as they had expected, and because the invitation had come from a mutual friend and not Brian Albert himself, they worried that maybe wires had been crossed and there wasn't really an after-party going on after all. So the idea was for John to go in first and see if they were welcome. Karen would wait in the car. And she did wait, long enough for her irritation to rise into anger. Maybe he was chatting, maybe he was ignoring her, maybe he was with someone else. After all, an ex-girlfriend lived in the neighborhood, and Karen was still feeling raw from the supposed Aruba makeout session she said she'd witnessed. In a haze of alcohol and jealousy, she assumed the worst.
She's a volatile person. I mean, she doesn't deny she's a volatile person. If you hear the 50-plus phone messages she left for him after she left 34 Fairview that night and before finding him in that morning, she is not happy. She's screaming, she's yelling, she's calling him a pervert. She's saying she, quote, fucking hates him, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot going on.
But come morning, the anger had been replaced by fear. John still wasn't home. He wasn't answering his phone. The panic in Karen's voice on early morning calls to friends is clear. Where's John? Do you know where he is? Jen McCabe, the homeowner's sister-in-law, told Karen not to drive around looking for John, but to come to her house. Instead, Karen started searching, picking up Carrie Roberts along the way. That's how, just after 6 a.m., they ended up back at 34 Fairview. For Karen, finding John's body was shattering. She was so distraught that she was taken to a hospital for observation. John was rushed to a hospital too, but to no avail.
He was actually dead at the scene, although he wasn't pronounced dead until he was in the hospital because he was cold at the scene. And they don't pronounce someone dead until it's called warm and dead versus cold and dead. It's kind of a crude term, but that's a first responder term. But he was actually dead already on the lawn. That's pretty clear.
Now later, Jen McCabe, remember, she's Brian Albert's sister-in-law, told police that Karen blurted out something incriminating amid the chaos. Did I hit him? Could I have hit him? There's no corroboration she said this, to be clear. It wasn't captured on the police dash cams or body cams, which were abundant after they responded to the 911 call. And some other stuff witnesses claimed had happened demonstrably did neither, per those recordings. For example, police found a search on Jen McCabe's phone that appeared to have been made at 2:27 in the morning. The search asked how long it takes for someone to die in the cold. Now, if the timestamp on the search is right, this is while Karen was asleep at the home and supposedly long before Jen knew that John was even missing, much less dead. But Jen said that timestamp was wrong, that she had actually made the search after she had helped discover John's body. She said Karen asked her to search for the answer while the two were praying in the back of a police car. But Lavoie says there's a problem with that scenario.
Neither Jen McCabe or Karen Reed ever gets into the back of a police car at 34 Fairview. And most notably, that search was deleted. It was one of the only searches on her phone out of thousands of searches that had been deleted. She also made multiple phone calls in that period of time that were later deleted, while no other phone calls on her phone or searches had been deleted. So yeah, there is some squirrely stuff going on.
But back to John, who was pronounced dead hours later, his injuries noted as blunt force trauma to the head and hypothermia. Within days, Karen went from grieving girlfriend to murder suspect. Prosecutors said she had reversed into him in a drunken rage, while Karen's lawyer, David Yannetti, argued that the state had it wrong. I mean, very wrong. No one knew yet just how messy and controversial this case would become.
Did you know using your browser in incognito mode doesn't actually protect your privacy? Take back your privacy with IPVanish VPN. Just one tap and all your data, passwords, communications, browsing history, and more will be instantly protected. IPVanish makes you virtually invisible online. Use IPVanish on all your devices, anytime you go online at home and especially on public Wi-Fi. Get IPVanish now for 70% off a yearly plan with this exclusive offer at ipvanish.com/audio.
The initial hours after John O'Keefe's body was taken from the lawn of 34 Fairview Road were chaotic. Canton officers used a leaf blower to clear snow in their search for evidence, scooping bloody snow into red Solo cups and plastic grocery bags. They failed to treat the Albert home like a potential crime scene. No search warrant was executed, no evidence from inside the house was collected. Jen McCabe and the Alberts were briefly questioned, but together, not separately, and the interviews were neither recorded nor transcribed. After 10 minutes, officers left. Soon after, the Canton Department recused itself. The reasons were obvious. The house where John was last seen alive belonged to Boston police officer Brian Albert. His brother Kevin was a detective with the Canton Police Department, and another brother, Chris, was a former Canton officer who had since moved into local politics. And with such close ties between the Albert family and local law enforcement, Canton Police handed the case over to the Massachusetts State Police. But there were still overlaps. See, the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office brought in Massachusetts State Trooper Michael Proctor, part of a detective unit that reported directly to the DA. Proctor's assignment should have ensured impartiality, but Proctor knew the Alberts well.
Now, Proctor knows almost all the players in this case already. They have this sort of familial relationship or acquaintance relationship. Maybe their kids play sports together. But there's social media photos of him with some of the major characters in this case.
There was even a social media post, I think on Facebook, by the Alberts matriarch that referred to Proctor as something akin to a surrogate son. So instead of Proctor assuaging concerns about the investigation, his appointment set the stage for one of the most controversial investigations the state has seen in decades. For starters, he didn't redo any of Canton's sloppy initial investigation, the half-assed interviews and bloody snow collected in grocery bags kind of stuff.
He didn't care about any of that. He was fine with it.
More importantly, Proctor decided early on he knew exactly what had happened to John O'Keefe. Within hours, he had seized Karen's Lexus SUV and her phone, and he fixated on Karen's cracked taillight. There's video of her SUV from that morning captured on O'Keefe's home security system as she backed out of his driveway to go searching for him. In it, the taillight appears to have a small crack. Damage she explained is coming from bumping O'Keefe's truck while backing out in a panic. But to Proctor, this broken taillight wasn't just a minor detail. It became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. In the hours after seizing Karen's car, Proctor created a text chain,
which included his supervisor, his other supervisor, some of his cop buddies, and some of his buddies from high school. And in that text chain and other chains, he basically said, we're gonna pin it on the girl. She did it. And the guy who owns the house is a Boston cop, so he's not gonna, quote, catch any shit. He also, by the way, disclosed in those texts that Karen Reed had Crohn's disease, although he called it, quote, a leaky balloon knot. And he also talked about her in a lot of other bad ways.
Actually, there's trial footage of Proctor being asked about these texts on the witness stand, so let's hear him explain them.
From all accounts, he didn't do anything wrong. She's a whack job. CUNT.
He also said that while she was a babe, she had no ass, which is obviously important information to gather during a death investigation. Now, Proctor said the text messages were
unprofessional and regrettable comments are something I'm not proud of, and I shouldn't have wrote in a private or any type of setting.
You think? Now, as he told friends and coworkers the case was a done deal, Proctor failed to do things you would expect a competent investigator to do.
He also had possession of a lot of the evidence in this case for months before turning it over to, for instance, the state lab for testing. He had possession of John O'Keefe's clothing. He had possession of the car. And it should be noted, pieces of the taillight from Karen's car were later found on the lawn at 34 Fairview Road up until a couple of weeks after this whole thing happened.
The taillight thing is important because it basically became the crown jewel of the state's evidence. But the way pieces of it surfaced was, at best, bizarre. No fragments were found during the initial daylight search of the Albert Yard on January 29th. None were recovered during subsequent early searches. It wasn't until Proctor greenlit a state emergency response team search after dark, more than 12 hours after the body was found, that red plastic pieces suddenly appeared. And the fragments kept appearing. Weeks later, former Canton Police Chief Ken Berkowitz claimed he spotted additional taillight pieces from his moving car while driving by the property. These pieces were handed over and added to evidence. Even more troubling, the taillight on Karen's SUV seemed to suffer greater damage once in police custody. Photos show it initially cracked, not shattered. Yet when jurors saw the car, the entire right taillight was gouged out. Defense experts argued that the missing diffuser, the internal component that helps the light function, proved the light was intact when Karen drove away from O'Keefe's driveway because the light was still illuminated on video. Without the diffuser, the light would have been dark. In other words, the car appeared to be more damaged later than it was at the time of the alleged hit and run. And this was later supported when Dighton Police Sergeant Nicholas Barrows testified that he'd been on hand to help state police tow Karen's vehicle from her parents' driveway in his jurisdiction.
I saw that there was some damage to the right rear taillight. To my best ability and recollection, that taillight was not completely damaged. It was cracked, and a piece was missing, but not completely damaged.
In fairness, that's not the only evidence presented, however. The prosecution also leaned on car data evidence showing Reed's SUV aggressively reversing, with a throttle trigger at about 74%, and argued that the crash likely occurred during that maneuver. They also pointed to DNA evidence. O'Keefe's genetic material was found on the shattered taillight, mixed with DNA from two other unknown individuals. Though even the state's expert conceded those additional contributors were unidentified and could be anybody. This trace mixture raised some questions about the strength of the forensic link. Meanwhile, the defense argued from the outset that investigators ignored other possibilities, namely that O'Keefe was injured inside the Albert home or in its garage, and his body moved outside. Proctor dismissed these theories outright. He never executed a search warrant on the house. He never tested the Albert's German Shepherd, Chloe, despite bite-like wounds on O'Keefe's right arm. He delayed interviewing Colin Albert, the homeowner's nephew, for more than a year. And when he finally did, the interview wasn't recorded. When details about Proctor's ties to the Albert and McCabe families came out, it only deepened suspicions of bias. His sister was close friends with Julie Albert, Brian's sister-in-law, and they shared dozens of phone calls in the months after Karen's arrest. Proctor's sister relayed that an Albert family member wanted to buy him a thank you gift when the case was over. Proctor replied that the gift should be for his wife. With Proctor's investigation as the foundation, prosecutors built their case around a simple narrative. Karen, drunk and furious after an argument, backed her Lexus into John O'Keefe, leaving him mortally injured in the snow. She drove away, never calling for help, and he died alone of hypothermia and head trauma. The physical evidence they leaned on was the broken taillight, alleged DNA on her bumper, and the fragments found in the yard. They played Karen's angry voicemails to John, dozens of them left between 1 a.m. and 6 a.m., full of screaming, profanity, and declarations that she hated him. And they painted her as erratic, vindictive, and drunk. But, as Lavoie points out, None of this actually proved that Karen had hit John with her car, either intentionally or accidentally.
They never explained how it happened. Even their crash reconstructionist couldn't reconstruct it, so they just weren't able to prove it at all.
John's body was on the other side of the yard. His phone had tracked his steps after he'd been dropped off, and that data suggested he'd walked some 80 feet, about the distance of his drop-off point to the house.
The wound pattern on John O'Keefe's head, according to multiple medical experts, matches him hitting an object with a corner or a ridge. And there's a pattern to it that looks like whatever he hit had like a graininess to it, like ridges or graininess. So I don't know, like think cement, like a cement stair, something like that.
All of this, as well as essentially every other piece of potential evidence pointing away from Karen, was ignored. We're talking things like the deleted "How long to die in cold" Google search on Jen McCabe's phone, time-stamped hours before O'Keefe's body was found, multiple phone calls between Brian Albert and Brian Higgins, that's the Boston cop homeowner, and the ATF guy who'd had a flirtation with Karen. Those were written off as butt dials.
And when the case progressed and they found out they were about to be served notice and they had to hand into their phones to investigators in the next couple of days, Brian Albert got rid of his whole old phone, got a new phone, and Brian Higgins drove to a military base at Cape Cod and threw his phone into one dumpster and his SIM card into a different dumpster.
Each questionable decision, each mislead, added weight to the defense's argument that the investigation wasn't just flawed, it was possibly rigged. The first criminal trial against Karen Read began in mid-April 2024. After nearly 2 months of testimony from dozens of witnesses, the jury deliberated for over a day before declaring themselves hopelessly deadlocked. On July 1st, 2024, Judge Beverly Cannoni declared a mistrial. By this time, Proctor's texts and conduct were public and damning. He was suspended, and after an internal investigation by the Massachusetts State Police, he was dishonorably discharged in 2025 for disclosing case details to non-law enforcement personnel, drinking on duty, and making derogatory comments about the defendant. A lot of people believe he's done much worse. From a 2020 interview with him.
Did you plant evidence?
Absolutely not. And I'm laughing because it's such a ridiculous accusation. It's something I would never do. I've never done.
You know, most people would.
And there's no evidence of it.
We're talking about people in your community, your neighbors, who believe it. This is not strangers. This is people in Canton. Why do you think that is?
That's just the loud minority.
That loud minority seems to be getting even louder.
Did you know using your browser in incognito mode doesn't actually protect your privacy? Take back your privacy with IPVanish VPN. Just one tap and all your data, passwords, communications, browsing history, and more will be instantly protected. IPVanish makes you virtually invisible online. Use IPVanish on all your devices, anytime you go online at home and especially on public Wi-Fi. Get IPVanish now for 70% off a yearly plan with this exclusive offer at ipvanish.com/audio.
After the hung jury in July 2024, the Karen Read case didn't fade from view. It exploded. What had already been a contentious trial became a lightning rod for public outrage and online sleuthing. Bloggers like Aiden Turtleboy Kearney, who had been hammering at the state's narrative since early on, doubled down, publishing hundreds of posts alleging corruption and evidence tampering. The FBI's quiet but ongoing investigation into the handling of the case only added fuel to the speculation. Even some jurors from the first trial added to the uproar. In post-trial interviews, several said they had actually agreed to acquit Karen on the most serious charges, but were tripped up by what they described as a confusing verdict form. They thought they would have the opportunity to clarify their intent, but instead watched as the entire proceeding was declared a mistrial. By the time prosecutors announced they would retry Read, the story had gone national. Vanity Fair ran in-depth features, social media feeds lit up with hashtags proclaiming Karen's innocence and demanding justice for John O'Keefe. What had started as a tragic death in a Boston suburb had morphed into a spectacle of courtroom drama, conspiracy allegations, and a debate over whether the system was protecting its own. That was the atmosphere as the second trial got underway in spring 2025. A lot of trial number 2 was rehashed from the first trial, with the prosecution's case still hinging on a simple theory that in the early morning hours of January 29th, 2022, Karen Reed, drunk and furious after an argument, backed her SUV into John O'Keefe, knocking him to the ground and leaving him to die in the snow. They painted her as reckless and volatile, pointing to her drinking that night, her angry voicemails, and the damage to her car. Special prosecuting attorney Hank Brennan leaned heavily on the emotional weight of O'Keefe's death. He reminded jurors that O'Keefe was a devoted cop and guardian to his orphan niece and nephew. He argued that Karen's behavior was evidence of a woman who snapped. Journalist Rebecca Lavoie again.
But the most compelling evidence of her guilt would be her broken taillight. The fact that she was drinking and that she was clearly mad at him that night because she left him dozens of voicemails saying that she, quote, fucking hated him, which, by the way, is not a great way to cover up that you just killed somebody.
In fairness, that's not all they presented. The Norfolk County DA's office wasn't giving up the fight. Brennan, brought in at extraordinary cost to taxpayers, tried to reframe the narrative. Gone was the emphasis on a dramatic launch across the yard of John O'Keefe's body into the snow. This time, the prosecution softened its theory. Maybe he stumbled. Maybe she clipped him at low speed. They still hung everything on Karen's drinking, her messages, and the broken taillight, but jurors weren't buying what they were selling. Prosecutors tried to rehabilitate the taillight evidence, but under cross-examination, it crumbled. The internal diffuser piece, a part that would have prevented any light from shining through, proved that the damage seen later wasn't the damage seen on the morning of January 29th. And the timing of when those plastic fragments appeared on the Albert lawn remained a glaring question mark. But the most compelling part of their argument wasn't science, it was emotion. David Yannetti, Karen's attorney, knew the case would come down to credibility. The defense's strategy was to dismantle the prosecution's narrative piece by piece and to present a rival theory that shifted suspicion onto the people inside the Albert home and cast doubt on the entire investigation. They'd done that in the first trial too, but things reached a whole nother level in the sequel. There were bombshells left and right. Now, for example, remember how Karen Reed called Jen McCabe when she realized John hadn't come home all night? Well,
after she gets off the phone with Karen Reed, Jen McCabe makes a short phone call to her sister, Nicole's phone, that was answered. And that call was less than a minute long, but it was still a call, right? It was answered, something happened on that call, and then they hung up.
That might not sound important at first, but some people believe that call was Jen McCabe telling her sister Nicole that Karen realized John was missing and you'd better get things straightened out at the house. And that's conjecture, of course, but there's a reason people find that call suspicious.
That call was also later deleted.
For the record, Jen McCabe says she doesn't remember making that call, and if it did happen, it wasn't nefarious. She couldn't explain why it had been deleted. Additionally, the defense called expert witnesses to testify that John O'Keefe's injuries weren't consistent with being struck by a vehicle. There were no broken bones, no internal injuries below the neck. Instead, the wounds suggested a fall or an attack. His right arm, covered in what appeared to be dog bites, pointed to the Albert's German Shepherd, Chloe, who had a history of violence against other animals, and, at least after O'Keefe's death, against people as well. The defense argued that John died inside the house or a garage after a confrontation and possibly an attack by the dog, and his body was moved later. Their message to the jury was clear. If you can't trust the investigation, you can't trust the charges. Outside the courthouse, the trial had already become a media circus. Local TV stations broadcast breathless updates. National outlets from Vanity Fair to LA Magazine sent reporters. Rebecca Lavoie was a regular on Court TV, and on top of that, she hosted a regular rundown on the case with podcaster Mel Barrett that they called the Readathon. It's worth noting that the Boston Globe live blogged the proceedings, but critics accused it of being too both sides about everything, ignoring some of the misconduct allegations and missing the deeper implications. And there was also Aidan Kearney, aka Turtle Boy.
Turtle Boy, he's a Trump voter. He said so on Twitter, and he is staunchly libertarian, like classic libertarian. Not like the Libertarian Party, but libertarian. He's also a former history teacher. He taught high school history before. His mother was a lawyer. He's super knowledgeable about the Constitution and American history, and he cares about that stuff a lot, civil and individual rights.
He'd been covering the case relentlessly since 2023. He wrote hundreds of posts accusing law enforcement of corruption and staging confrontational interviews with the Alberts and McCabe's. His coverage was sensational, but often accurate.
And when I interviewed him on my show, the first time I talked to him, I said, you don't seem to fall into the typical political demographic of somebody who would be speaking out and reporting on and investigating and writing about the police so often. And I said, why are you so interested in this? And his answer was, because they have all the guns.
In short, it was about power. And Turtle Boy has hundreds of thousands of followers across YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram. So his coverage of this case helped draw a lot of attention to it. Karen herself also fed the media fire.
She gave so many media interviews, and her lawyers now say that was completely intentional. Like, she gave media interviews that they played clips of in the second trial that, frankly, made her look bad. But they also kind of humanized her. They knew she wasn't going to testify, so it was a way to get her voice into court. And of course, in the clips, she never confessed to anything.
The defense strategy in the second trial was both bolder and more methodical. They brought back the forensic experts, who again testified that O'Keefe's injuries didn't match a car strike. They pointed to the temperature data on his phone, consistent with being indoors before being moved. They used phone records and deleted data to underscore a pattern of suspicious behavior from those inside the Albert home. And they leaned into Michael Proctor. The disgraced state trooper was no longer the looming figure in the courtroom. He wasn't even called to testify. But his shadow hung over everything. Jurors saw the text where he declared Karen guilty before the investigation had barely begun. They heard how he mocked her medical conditions and boasted about, quote, pinning it on the girl, end quote. The defense also had the advantage of seeing the feds' files into the handling of the death investigation. While the defense couldn't tell jurors outright that FBI agents were involved in the case, jurors did hear about outside law enforcement agents interviewing witnesses, and the defense even used some of the experts the FBI had relied upon for things like accident reconstruction. The FBI, by the way, also consulted experts that concluded O'Keefe had not been struck by a vehicle, period. Evidence the defense included in the trial without acknowledging its provenance. When deliberations began, there was no confusion this time. After weeks of testimony, the jury acquitted Karen Read on the most serious charges: second-degree murder, manslaughter, and leaving the scene of a fatal collision. They convicted her only of the minor charge of operating under the influence, something she had admitted she'd done, for which she got only 1 year of probation. The verdict was a stunning rebuke to prosecutors. The jury didn't just reject their theory, they implicitly endorsed the defense's argument that the investigation had been tainted from the start. The acquittal set off shockwaves. Supporters of Karen cheered the decision as a victory for truth in the face of a corrupted system. The Alberts and McCabe's released a joint statement calling the verdict a devastating miscarriage of justice. Meanwhile, the FBI's investigation, still largely under wraps, continues to loom. The news coverage of Karen Reed's acquittal seemed wall to wall. If you consume news at all, you couldn't have missed it. But if you were like me, you might not have understood the ins and outs of the case while it was unfolding. Normally, I prefer covering older cases, especially in this podcast, because time lets us see the ramifications with more clarity. There might be some developments in the next few years that warrant an update on this case. But for now, here's what we know. The circumstances of John O'Keefe's death are still frustratingly unclear. The Alberts made some decisions after the death that likely mean we might never know the truth. Namely, they sold the house on Fairview Road. On its own, that might not seem like a big deal. People move all the time, after all. But in this case, that house had been in the family for more than 70 years. So the timing has raised some eyebrows, as has this.
Not only did they sell their house, but they actually ripped up some of the flooring in their house and replaced it.
That would be flooring in the basement, an area some believe could have been the site of a confrontation. Now again, this is conjecture. Lots of people make updates to their homes before selling them. I did a thorough paint job and some home repairs before selling a house myself. Besides, not everyone thinks that the basement is the most likely place John might have met his fate, if he met it at the Albert house at all.
So in the second trial, it became kind of clear that the defense believed that whatever happened to John O'Keefe potentially happened in the garage. This is something that I have long thought about, kind of feel proud of myself for having thought of this before the defense.
We'll give Lavoie a minute here to share her hypothesis.
The garage theory kind of matches up with a bunch of stuff in the case. There's some phone data, for instance, that shows John taking steps that are equivalent to about 80-ish feet, which would take him from Karen Reed's car into the house or in the garage. The garage door is right next to the door to the house. And in a text chain later between members of that family, Matt McCabe, Jen McCabe's husband, says, "Tell them the guy never went in the house." That's a quote. This has been interpreted in a couple of ways. One is to lie. Tell them he never came in. The way I've always interpreted it is that maybe he went in, but not technically to the house proper. So imagine a scenario in which, this is obviously speculation, but imagine this scenario. A couple of guys, one of them is kind of potentially heated about John O'Keefe because he feels snubbed by John O'Keefe's girlfriend and may have told his best friend, the other guy, about it. Maybe they're yakking about it in the garage, which, by the way, is also maybe where they kept Chloe, the aggressive dog, to keep her away from people because she's not good with people. Perhaps when John O'Keefe approached the door, he saw those guys in there, or they said, "Hey, Johnny, come in here and talk to us." And that may have been where everything kind of went down. And the garage, it also somewhat matches the phone temperature data on John O'Keefe's phone. After 12:32-ish, the temperature began to drop on his phone and then sort of stayed steady at around 55 degrees. And it was really, really cold outside with this huge wind chill. And his phone was found outside with him. It was under the shoulder of his body, but his phone temperature stayed really steady at about 55 degrees until the time, or just before the time, his body was actually found. So it kind of matches with the phone being somewhere that wasn't outside proper, but also not inside. So to me, the garage is a reasonable fit for this. It has the surfaces, it has the distance, and it potentially has Chloe.
That's one theory, one that jibes with the defense's apparent view of things. But unless someone steps forward to tell us more about what happened that night, we might never know if it's the right theory. What we do know is that the case has exposed some serious problems with how area police investigate crimes. Other cases handled by Proctor have begun to unravel. Defense attorneys across Massachusetts are citing the Reed case as evidence of systemic rot in law enforcement. And for the media, the case became a referendum on trust. While independent bloggers like Turtle Boy amplified public skepticism, mainstream outlets that had once parroted the prosecution's line were suddenly scrambling to report on the misconduct and cover-ups the bloggers had flagged months earlier. Even with her acquittal, Karen Reed's life is forever changed. She lost her career, her savings, and her home. The children she'd started to help raise believe she killed their uncle. And on top of that, those poor children lost another set of parental figures just after being orphaned. The case exposes a grim reality. When police close ranks, when prosecutors pursue convictions at all costs, and when evidence is manipulated or mishandled, justice becomes almost impossible to achieve. For Crimes of the Centuries, this case earns its place not because of the brutality of the crime, but because of what it reveals about power. The death of John O'Keefe is a tragedy. The prosecution of Karen Read, built on shaky evidence, tainted investigations, and a refusal to investigate all possibilities, may be a tragedy of its own. This isn't just a crime to look back on. It's a story still unfolding. And one day, when the full truth comes out, if it does, it may indeed stand as one of the most notorious future crimes of the centuries. To research this case, I read contemporary news coverage, watched some of the videos of trial testimony, and interviewed Rebecca Lavoie, who is an expert on the case. I tried to include voices of people believing in Karen's guilt, but there aren't that many of them. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Ben Scoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.